Alrighty, well, we're ready to move on, I think, into Revelation chapter 17, unless there's any questions about last week. I think by now you're getting probably the idea that there is a lot of recycling through similar ideas in the book of Revelation, just presented with a different set of images. And that's not unusual in the Scripture. When the Lord is intending on doing something, He usually sends a couple of different messages in a couple of different ways. And especially when He's going to do something as significant as this, which is destroying His temple and putting an end once and for all to the Old Testament, to the Old Covenant sacrificial system. I think from the time that Rome besieged Jerusalem and burned down the temple that there haven't been any sacrifices because there hasn't been any temple. And of course, at the same time, showing that the Lord is putting aside ethnic Israel once and for all, even though He is redeeming to Himself those elect among the Jews that He has foreknown and foreloved for all eternity. The one thing that can be a little bit confusing is, since the Lord is giving this in several different images, He often refers to the same, let me put it this way, He refers to the same entity, that is Jerusalem or Israel, in several different ways. I was just thinking about that this morning. One of the reasons I came out here just a little bit late was I was trying to figure out if I could go back and quickly cull together what those images were, but wasn't terribly successful. But they're called the tribes of the earth, or the tribes of the land. Oftentimes the judgments are represented as being poured out on the earth, but again, from what we've seen, the word earth there most likely means land, and that certainly is one of its meanings in Greek. The judgment is clearly against Israel for their rejection of the Messiah, and so the land being referred to here is basically the boundaries of the Promised Land. I believe that it's also been represented as Egypt and as, Sodom. And it's been called the Great City. It's referring, of course, to Jerusalem. We're going to see that image again here, but we also saw it last week in chapter 16, where it talked about there was a great earthquake and the great city was split into three pieces, or into three segments. And we saw how that was actually fulfilled in the war of Rome against the Jewish nation. How it brought about civil war, or at least exacerbated the civil war that was going on already among Jews, and there were basically three warring factions. And that especially escalated when Jerusalem was surrounded and all the Jews were trapped inside. That was kind of their last stand after they had lost all the battles in the countryside. Also, we've discovered that there's one image or one term, the beast, that seems to refer to several different people. And actually this morning, if we get to it, we're going to see that the beast is not only Nero, but he also happens to be another one of the Caesars. And the thing that ties them all together, the thing that they all have in common, is the fact that they're all a part of Rome. So the beast generally means Rome, and individually can mean different of the Caesars. The beast that warred with the saints, they were given into his hands for a period of time. That was Caesar Nero. He's the one who has the number 666. But there are also other, at least one other individual that beast is pointing to, and we see that in chapter 17 when it says that the beast is an eighth and not one of the seven, because Nero was the sixth. And yet the beast is also number 8, so we have to make sense out of that. So anyway, I think last week we were looking at the 7 bowl judgments. We saw that they pretty much parallel the trumpet judgments. We see that there's an intensification of God's judgment against Israel. We do need to remember that this is a very serious event that is going on. I don't think the Lord has ever poured out His wrath to this degree against any nation in the world. And the reason He did this, of course, is because of the privileged position that Israel had. Because they were given the oracles of God, because God had made His covenant with them, because they had all this knowledge and all this privilege to know God, and yet they sinned against all this light. Remember how Jesus said of Capernaum that It would be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city, because Jesus preached there. But what about the Jews that had the Word of God for all those centuries and had that lineage of faithful patriarchs before them? They had so many privileges that the judgment is tremendous, and especially when having all those privileges, they rejected the Son of God. Okay, so last week we, let's see, another way that Jerusalem was represented, we saw last week, it was called the throne of the beast, because the beast had actually set up his dominion there. They were under his rule. So another way in which Israel is represented in the book of Revelation. And of course, the sixth angel pouring out his bowl on the river dries up the Euphrates. The Roman armies begin to march, and they're gathered together at Armageddon, which was a very significant place for Israel, since there are actually a couple of very significant battles that were fought there. The last one was a great defeat. That was Josiah going against Pharaoh Necho. And I think this imagery is alluded to because as the Roman armies converge on Jerusalem, there's going to be another great defeat. And the last thing we saw was the seventh angel pouring out his bowl upon the kingdom of the beast, or upon the city. There were flashes of lightning, peals of thunder, a great earthquake. The great city was split into three parts. Babylon the Great was remembered before God. Now here's another image that's used. Now think about all these images that are used for the Jews, for Jerusalem. I think you'll see that the book of Revelation is painting it, of course, as a villain. Egypt is a villain. Sodom is a villain. Babylon is a villain. And as we get into our text this morning, we're going to see Jerusalem now represented as the great harlot. And harlot also is a villain. All of them evil. As a matter of fact, the fact that Jerusalem is a harlot is the reason why the seventh bowl really amounted to the Lord stoning Jerusalem for her infidelity. Remember that the punishment for adultery in the Old Testament, at least one of them, was stoning. And here the Lord is stoning Jerusalem for her spiritual adultery. The Romans literally did launch 100-pound stones into the city, as you'll recall. We looked at last time from a quote from Josephus. Okay, if there aren't any questions on that, let me begin by reading chapter 17, the doom of Babylon. And we really have in chapter 17 and 18 that same theme. Chapter 17 is long enough. I don't think we're going to get through that entirely today, but chapter 18 also covers basically the same subject, and we'll begin to see a little bit how this applies to Jerusalem. Let me go ahead and read it to get the context. And one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I shall show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations, and of the unclean things of her immorality. And upon her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. And the angel said to me, Why do you wonder? I shall tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and to go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth will wonder, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is. the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. And the beast which was and is not is himself also an eighth, and is one of the seven, and he goes to destruction. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. Well, we need an interpretation of the interpretation, don't we? At least the angel explained that particular portion of it. Now, if this is the first time you've read it, I'm sure it sounds thoroughly confusing. And if you've read it several times, it's probably still very confusing. But the more you read it and the more you look at it from this perspective of moderate preterism, the more sense it makes. So let's begin to unravel some of this, and perhaps we won't get through the whole chapter, but we'll do what we can. Obviously, this chapter has to do with judgment upon Babylon. Verse 1. Then one of the angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. And by the way, this judgment now upon the harlot is not as though she's just now beginning to be judged, but this is the judgment that has been poured out. And actually what we see is the result of that judgment, when we see that the beast turns on the woman and basically leaves her, desolate, naked, eats up her flesh, burns her with fire. Basically, she's destroyed, right? Well, that's exactly what happens, of course, to Jerusalem in 70 A.D. And again, we've seen how these images we've seen to this point, a majority of them, are pointing to the judgments God poured out upon Egypt. He is placing them upon Jerusalem. Another image, a beast turns on the woman and devours her. It's basically talking about the same thing, just using different images. Now, at the very beginning, as we open the book of Revelation, and this is something else that I had to think about, because it's been a while now. We've been in it for several weeks. And I was thinking it might be helpful when we get to the end that deals with the book of, or at least that deals with Jerusalem. Because remember, the book of Revelation also speaks about things that are yet in the future. I forget whether we had the moderate preterism here. Chapters 4 through 19 are basically dealing with this small period of time between the first coming and 70 A.D., and even narrower than that, it's dealing with just perhaps a decade, perhaps less than a decade, before 70 A.D. As a matter of fact, I forget now exactly the date of the war with Rome, when it began, but it's dealing primarily with that. So it's dealing with just a very small portion of time here. But then in chapter 20, it really spans several millennia. So far it's been 2,000 years, or getting close to it, from 70 A.D. all the way to the second coming, whenever that's going to take place. And then the second coming is dealt with in chapter 20, verses 11 through 15, and then the eternal state in chapters 21 through 22. So the book of Revelation doesn't deal exclusively with this judgment of God upon Jerusalem, but a majority of it does. And I thought maybe when we get to the end of 19, or maybe when we get to the end of the book, whichever would be handier, it would be good just to do sort of a bird's eye view of the whole thing again, because I'm sure we've already forgotten what a lot of the details mean. We can't go into all the details again, but if we get a broad stroke of it, at least perhaps we'll be able to gather all together and have a working picture of Revelation. Because one thing we don't want to have at the end of this time is come away without understanding what the book of Revelation means. We're spending a good deal of time trying to understand it. Okay, but one of the things we looked at the very beginning was the fact that there are two women who are highlighted in the book of Revelation. And we're introduced now to one of the two women, and that is the harlot. Chapters 17 and 18 actually deal with the harlot and the Lord putting her away. Remember the scroll with the seven seals. Gentry believes, and rightfully so, to be a divorce document. The Lord is putting away faithless Israel for her spiritual adultery. And that's why she's here represented as a harlot. You know, that imagery is used because the Lord is in covenant with Israel. He has taken her as His wife. But she has been unfaithful time and again, and so the Lord's putting her away and so forth. But we also have in the book several representations where it's just simply represented as judgment and so forth without allusion necessarily to infidelity or harlotry or so forth. But this is using the image of a marriage, whereas the other is using, again, other images. But after the Lord puts faithless Israel away, which is what is being dealt with in chapter 17 and 18, then in chapter 19 we're introduced to the new bride that He is taking to Himself, the bride of Christ. And as you know, I think by now, the bride of Christ is made up of the elect, both from the Jews and from the Gentiles, those who trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. So Israel rejected their Messiah and God's plan for them. God says He was going to destroy them. He was going to cause all the blood shed on earth, the righteous blood, to fall on them. But as He puts them away, He has also taken to Himself a faithful bride. So now the angel calls to John to come and see the judgment of the great harlot. Now, I remember that as I read the book of Revelation over the years and I've started being introduced to this idea of moderate preterism, the one thing that kept occurring to me as I looked at that is that the woman, to me, because she sits on the beast with seven heads and the seven heads are seven hills, that the woman must be Rome. Okay, that was what I was thinking for a while, but I think there are good arguments to see her, of course, not as Rome, but as Jerusalem. Now, the reason why we might think of her as Rome is, I already mentioned, she's represented as sitting on seven hills. In verse 1, she is the great harlot who sits on many waters. And the idea of sitting on waters, the waters, well, we've already seen the interpretation later in the book, is representing many peoples and nations and so forth. And the fact that the woman is sitting on them shows some sort of influence or dominion over them. And that seems to point to Rome too. And then the nations have grown wealthy by her trade. That's something that we won't see until chapter 18, verse 3. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. That sounded to me like Rome too. But we're going to see how these things can also apply to Jerusalem or to the Jews, because you probably know the Jews are notorious for being great businessmen. And that didn't start just with our generation, but that's been true through the years because they're so energetic and so passionate about what they do. That was true back in these days, and they were very wealthy and influential. Okay. But we've already seen that the harlot is Jerusalem, and here's some things about the woman that show us that this must be the case. First of all, in verse 6, she is the one who is drunk with the blood of the saints. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. Now, it is true that Rome, it was already given into the hands of the beast to make war with the saints and to overcome them for 42 months. So in one respect, Rome has also bloodied her hands with the blood of the saints. But remember, Jesus charges specifically the blood of the saints, of all the righteous blood shed on earth, at least from Zechariah or from Abel to Zechariah, on this generation. And I believe this is what he's making allusion to here. Now, she is the one whom the Lord would actually desolate through Rome. Now think, if this woman were actually Rome, how could we make sense of verse 16? And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. Now, what is the beast? What is the beast? Just generally. Yes. The beast is Rome. So is the beast going to turn on... If the harlot is Rome and the beast turns on the harlot, how can the harlot be Rome? Right? That's not going to work. But does Rome turn on Israel? Does it turn on Jerusalem and burn her up? Yes. Okay. So there's a good argument for the fact that the woman can't be Rome. Jerusalem is also the one that is called the great city. Now at the end of chapter 17, and the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. We've already been told what the great city is in chapter 11, verse 8, talking about the two witnesses. Their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. The great city in that passage is definitely referring to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem we also saw was the great city that we saw that was split into three factions, chapter 16, verse 19. And the great city was split into three parts. And the cities of the nations fell. And Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of His fierce wrath. Now we saw how, during the Civil War, this city was actually, Jerusalem was split into three parts, three factions. Okay? So I believe that again, the great city in this case was also referring to Jerusalem, and now we see this harlot, this Babylon the Great, is called the great city, and that is referring to Jerusalem. She has committed spiritual adultery against the Lord, of course, and that's why she's represented as a harlot. She's the one who has rejected God. And we know that she rejected God because when God sent His Son to them to receive as their king, they rejected Him and they crucified Him. Okay. They submitted instead to the emperor worship when they cried out, "We have no king but Caesar." They rejected Him. As far as the guilt of His blood, let it be upon us and upon our children. And that's exactly where the Lord laid it. Okay, not His atoning blood, but the guilt of His blood for having put Him to death. Okay. So for her unfaithful, and that should be unfaithfulness, to the covenant, the Lord is now pursuing His lawsuit against her, that is a divorce against Israel. I just wanted to repeat all that so I would get it again fresh into your minds. Okay. Any questions up to this point? Okay. Now, what about the fact that she sits on many waters? Okay. Well, the fact is, Jerusalem was not necessarily a city that had the authority over the world, but that's not necessarily what's meant here, but rather that her influence was very widespread. You'll recall that before Rome conquered the world, there were other countries that conquered the world. As a matter of fact, we'll see that in the morning worship service. The first one was Babylon, and then after that Persia, and then after that Greece, and we're already to Greece in the morning series on the history of redemption. But Babylon was the one, well actually before that Assyria took the northern kingdom of Israel into captivity. Then Babylon took the southern kingdom into captivity. But when it did that, basically the people were dispersed in a variety of different places. The king of Assyria actually, in order to maintain control over the nations that they had conquered, they dislocated the people or relocated the people. They took them out of their cities, out of their countries, out of their familiar territories, and put them into other countries. And they mixed people around like this so that they wouldn't feel obligated to fight for their country, because now they're strangers in a strange place. And that tends to kind of take the desire to fight out of you. Okay. Well, in doing that, the Jews are dispersed all over the place, aren't they? And by the time Rome comes and they conquer the world, the Jews are everywhere. And that's what we see here, the fact that Israel as a nation has a widespread influence, virtually a presence in every nation throughout the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, we get an indication of that in Acts chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, because one thing that the Jews had to do according to the law of God was every year when they celebrated Pentecost, there were actually 3 feasts where all the males were to appear before the Lord in Jerusalem. And Pentecost was one of those feasts. And that's why when the Lord sent His Spirit upon the disciples as they were in the upper room praying and so forth, and they began speaking with these other languages. It drew all these crowds, and the crowds heard them speaking in their native tongues. There was a common language, which was Greek, but there was also the individual dialects that they had from the different places which they came. So anyway, we read in Acts chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, some of the places from which they came, and basically it's all over the map. And how is it that we each hear them in our own language to which we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, that's where the Euphrates River is, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the districts of Libya around Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them in our own tongues speaking of the mighty deeds of God. If you were to take and look on a map, you would see that this basically is from every quarter of the Roman Empire. We have a quote from Bass in his book, Back to the Future. He says this: the Roman Hellenistic period, and this is actually quoting from someone else, I think. The Roman Hellenistic period is characterized by an increase in the number of Jews throughout the civilized world. Hundreds of thousands of Jews lived in Babylon, Syria, Cyprus, Asia Minor, Egypt, let's see how would you pronounce that, Syriaca, the Dodecanese Islands, Greece, and Italy. Their number grew from generation to generation by the combined effect of natural increase, migration from Palestine, and conversions to Judaism, which reached record proportions during the generation preceding the destruction of the temple. So the fact is that her influence is very widespread because the Jews are everywhere. Now, we see more of that in verse 2 when it says, the great harlot, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. Now, we already saw in, actually, chapter 14, verse 8, that very same statement. And another angel, a second one, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. And by the way, this that particular statement follows, well, it happens to fall after those two chapters, which were kind of an interlude describing to us who the dragon was and the beast and all of that. And let's see, getting back, it's after the trumpet statements. But I want you to notice again that it's already, the book of Revelation has already made reference to the fact that Babylon the Great has fallen, which means that these judgments that came before were not centered on something different than what this chapter is focusing on. It's still judgment against Babylon the Great. And I just say that to make sure you understand that John is not, or the vision is now not switching to another location as far as God judging someone differently. Like the first ones were against Israel, but now somehow the harlot is somebody different. So I should have actually included that with the others. But she has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. Now, what is this immorality that she is spreading? It's spiritual idolatry. You know, she's a harlot, but she's not literally a harlot. She's not committing acts of infidelity to a literal marriage or spreading, let's say, some kind of sexual immorality throughout the empire. But the kind of immorality that she's spreading is spiritual immorality to all the nations, because the Jews live throughout the Roman Empire. Okay? So, anyway, this influence that she exerted is really centered, well, actually, I should say it's widespread. It's not really even centered anywhere, except perhaps in Jerusalem. I have a couple of quotes here that indicate the way that Jerusalem is basically seen as presiding over all the different cities and all the different government that is going on throughout all of the Promised Land. And then another reference that talks about how it also affected the kings of the nations, or at least how Jerusalem had was influencing these other nations. Let me just point out as we begin that Jerusalem, as you know, is very central to the Jewish religion. And if you're a Jew, no matter where you are in the Roman Empire, you're always going to have some reference, some respect to Jerusalem. You know how the Muslims talk about their pilgrimage to Mecca, and perhaps for different Christian denominations and so forth, there's a particular place of great significance where if you go there, you basically say, I'm making my pilgrimage or something like that. For the church during the medieval time and perhaps the Middle Ages, it was Rome. And today, for Roman Catholics, it still happens to be Rome. Well, for the Jews, it was Jerusalem because that's where things were centered. Jerusalem was central. Jerusalem was called the royal city. Jerusalem was very, very influential. As a matter of fact, when you look at the book of Acts and you see the spread of early Christianity, you see that the church was actually headquartered, or at least the leadership of the church was headquartered in Jerusalem. Almost like the Lord is drawing a parallel between the Old Covenant people and the New Covenant people. And of course, when He destroys the Old Jerusalem, He has a New Jerusalem which is prepared for His church, but that one's in heaven. But they're both children of Jerusalem. It just depends on which Jerusalem. And as they went out and they evangelized, the Lord was very careful to make sure that He tied all those groups of people coming into the church to the church in Jerusalem. And that's the reason why when Philip went to Samaria and he preached the gospel and many were converted, many were believed and were baptized, none of them received the Holy Spirit until Peter and John came down, representatives of the Jerusalem church. When they came down, they laid hands on them, prayed for them, and they received the Spirit. But they didn't when Philip was there. And why not? Well, it's because the Lord wanted to tie that church that was being established in Samaria to the church in Jerusalem. And it seems as though He wanted to be very careful to do that. Well, again, the Old Covenant people of God were all tied to Jerusalem as well. Jerusalem had very strong influence. So again, you have the harlot, who is basically Jerusalem, sitting upon many waters. Now let me read for you these couple of quotes. The first one comes from Josephus in the Wars of the Jews. And by the way, the kings of the earth don't necessarily have to be taken as the kings over all the Roman Empire. It can just simply mean the kings or those princes that dwell within the land, because earth often means land in the book of Revelation. In the limits of Samaria and Judea lies the village Anuath, which is also named Borseos. This is the northern boundary of Judea. The southern parts of Judea, if they be measured lengthways, are bounded by a village adjoining to the confines of Arabia. The Jews that dwell there call it Jordan. However, its breadth is extended from the river Jordan to Joppa. The city of Jerusalem is situated in the very middle, on which account some have, with sagacity or wisdom enough, called that city the navel of the country. Nor indeed is Judea destitute of such delights as come from the sea, since its maritime places extend as far as Ptolemais. It was parted into 11 portions, of which the royal city Jerusalem was the supreme and presided over all the neighboring country as the head does over the body. As to the other cities that were inferior to it, they presided over their several toparchies. Not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Gophna was the second of those cities, and next to that, Acrabata. After them, Thana and Lydda, and Emmaus, and Pella, and Idumea, and Engedi, and Herodium, and Jericho. And after them came Jamnia and Joppa, as presiding over the neighboring people. And besides these, there was the region of Gamala, and Galanitis, and Battania, and Trachonitis, which are also parts of the kingdom of Agrippa. This last country begins at Mount Libanus and the fountains of Jordan, and reaches breadthways to the lake of Tiberias, and in length is extended from a village called Arpha as far as Julius. Its inhabitants are a mixture of Jews and Syrians, and thus have I. Well, it probably means should be a with there, with all possible brevity. You know, when I cut and pasted this, I didn't notice the typos. describe the country of Judea and those that lie round about it. Now, the main part was the fact that Jerusalem is a royal city. Jerusalem was supreme and presided over all the others. So again, the harlot, as it were, sitting over the waters with the kings of the earth, commits immorality with the princes of the land, all involved in this rejection of the Messiah. And concerning the nation in a larger sense, we read this from Philo in a letter to Gaius. Concerning the holy city, I must now say what is necessary. It, as I have already stated, is my native country, and the metropolis, not only of the one country of Judea, but also of many, by reason of the colonies which it has sent out from time to time into the bordering districts of Egypt, Phoenicia, Syria in general, and especially that part of it which is called Chalo-Syria, and also with those more distant regions of Pamphylia, Cilicia, the greater part of Asia Minor as far as Bithynia, and the furthermost corners of Pontus. And in the same manner into Europe, into Thessaly, and let's see, we can either say that's Boeotia. That O-E can either be pronounced as an Oi or an A, Boeotia, and Macedonia, and Aetolia, and Attica, and Argos, and Corinth, and all the most fertile and wealthiest districts of Peloponnesus. And not only are the continents full of Jewish colonies, but also all the most celebrated islands are so too, such as Euboea, and Cyprus, and Crete. I say nothing of the countries beyond the Euphrates, for all of them, except a very small portion, and Babylon, and all the satrapies or satrapies around, which have any advantages whatever of soil or climate, have Jews settled in them. So that if my native land is, as it reasonably may be, looked upon as entitled to a share in your favor, it is not one city only that would be benefited by you, but 10,000 of them in every region of the habitable world. In Europe, in Asia, and in Africa, on the continent, in the islands, on the coasts, and in the inland parts. And it corresponds well to the greatness of your good fortune that by conferring benefits on one city, you should also benefit 10,000 others, so that your renown may be celebrated in every part of the habitable world, and many praises of you may be combined with thanksgiving. So again, is Jerusalem influential? Does Jerusalem sit upon many waters? Has Jerusalem committed immorality with the kings of the earth and with those who dwell on the earth made drunk with the wine of her immorality? If we're talking about spiritual immorality, you can see how widespread the influence of the Jews were. The reason why I spend time on that is because it seems like this might be one thing that doesn't really make sense with Jerusalem, but I think it does. Let's see. Okay. Let's go one further section here. Now we see the woman revealed. And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now here, I think we see some good insight into who this woman is. Now, let's see. I'm going to be careful I don't bite off more than I can chew here. The woman is represented, first of all, in a wilderness because of her spiritual infidelity. One of the things that was true of God's threats against Israel, and even with regard to Adam and Eve, when Adam and Eve sinned, they were removed from a paradise and they were put into a wilderness. Okay. When the nation of Israel sinned against the Lord and He sent them into exile, He sent them towards the east. And by the way, that's also where Adam and Eve settled, was east. I believe that's also where Cain, in a certain sense, went out east. East was always a sign of curse. Okay? And when Jesus Christ begins His ministry, the first thing He does before He begins it, after He's baptized, is He goes out into the wilderness and He's fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. And He's out there with the beasts, one of the wild beasts, one of the gospel writers says. The idea is that that's a place of desolation because sin brings desolation. The Bible talks about the earth being this great paradise, but it's been laid waste by the fact that sin has turned it into a wilderness. And even in the Psalms, when it talks about how the Lord will bless Israel, it talks about all this blooming, blossoming, growing, how the mountains will clap their hands, as it were. I'm trying to think of some of the other imagery that's used. The idea of the land flowing with milk and honey. It's a productive land, a prosperous land. There's the animals are begetting and they're giving their milk. The bees are producing honey and so forth. So it's fruitful. And yet, when the Lord curses, He describes the land as just being simply laid waste, becoming a desolation. Well, here we see the woman out in the desolation. By the way, Jesus went out into the wilderness because it was representative of what sin had done, and He was basically recapitulating what happened with Adam and also with the people of Israel. You know how the people of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, wasn't it, I think? Until all that generation had died off. They were in the wilderness because they were basically under God's curse. They were all going to wander till the men of war had all died off. Jesus is basically retracing the steps of His people, but instead of being unfaithful and suffering for them, He's suffering in their place. He's in the wilderness because His people had suffered or had sinned against the Lord. So recapitulating this history, again, wilderness is a sign of curse. And so we have the woman represented in the wilderness because of her spiritual infidelity and the fact that she has been rejected by God. Now, she's sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names with 7 heads and 10 horns. Before I forget it, I think I forgot to include in the notes a reference to the blasphemous names. The 7 heads represent 7 kings. And each of those kings, for the most part, as all the Caesars did, actually laid claim to deity. And that was blasphemous in the sight of God. And I think the idea that the 7 heads have blasphemous names, or that the scarlet beast is full of blasphemous names, has to do with that type of emperor worship. Now, we know that the beast is Rome. We know the beast can be singled out as an individual. We know the beast also can be corporate. We also know that Satan is also described very similar to this. And the first beast is described as this. The second beast is kind of similar to it, but not quite. But it shows us that Satan is the empowering force, as it were, behind Rome or behind this beast. Now, the woman is shown sitting on the beast because at this time, Israel really depended upon Rome for her national existence. As a matter of fact, every nation did. Rome was the world power. And it was only by being subject to Rome did you even exist as a corporate or a national entity. If you rebelled against Rome, they would just simply destroy you. So she's sitting on the beast, showing that she actually depends upon Rome for her existence. And remember that when Israel went to crucify the Lord Jesus Christ, they also leaned upon Rome. When the chief priests did that, they also called the Roman procurator into the matter, because they didn't have the authority to put people to death, although that didn't stop them on other occasions. It did in this. They didn't want to put Jesus to death, perhaps because He was such a public figure, but wanted to turn Rome against Him so that they would crucify Him. And as far as the people were concerned, they would be innocent of His blood. So Israel did, as a matter of fact, or Jerusalem, the center of Israel, rest upon Rome. The 7 heads refer to 7 Roman emperors, which we're going to see a little bit more in a moment, maybe next week. And the 10 horns to 10 regional monarchs that are subject to Rome. Now, let me try to get this point out before we close, and that is the fact, the way that she's clothed. Actually, these next several things are all of a piece, and they basically represent the harlot as being a priest. The way that she is clothed, the thing that she has on her forehead, which says Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and so forth, and the cup that she has in her hand. All of these things are representative of the priesthood. And we'll actually look at that a little bit more, but the idea is that this is apostate Judaism. They have rejected their Lord, and yet they're continuing to worship. Their worship is an abomination to God. Everything about them, God has rejected. So she's represented as basically, instead of a priest, she's a harlot. And she's decked out with all these trappings of a priest just to show how unfaithful Israel has been to the covenant. Okay? And we'll get into that perhaps a little bit more next time. I wanted to take a little bit more time to get through this just so we could review a little bit. Also because there were some sticky wickets in here. But another benefit, of course, of this, I didn't want to try to zoom through 8 pages. That's just a lot to go through in one sitting. With Presbytery coming up this week as well, I'm not going to have as much time to prepare for Sunday school, so this will give me some material for us to deal with next time. So I'm just going to stop here and ask if there's any questions. Any questions? Is this, again, is it making sense? Do you see the correlations? These other views take these images and they try to apply them to particular historic events that happen, between 70 A.D. and the present, or to different cycles that are just sort of generally true. Babylon isn't really any specific entity, but rather is perhaps the world system in opposition to God, and God's going to pour out judgment upon them and so forth. So it just deals with it in these kinds of terms. But you can make these terms plastic, and you can stretch them, and you can mold them, and you can apply them just about to anything you want. But you can see, though, how this really is tying the imagery to the Old Testament and to Israel, and fits very well the temporal context of the book of Revelation, that these things were going to happen soon. They were very significant. And we see why Jerusalem, why the Jews are being represented as they are. Very fitting for having broken the covenant. Richard, you had a question?
I'm curious what the Catholics think about this, that Rome is so evil and everything, and they think it's so holy.
The funny thing is that the Roman Catholic Church, and don't discount this view on account of it, but I think they're sympathetic to this view. Because they especially don't like this view. And I don't think they'd have any problem with this, with dispensationalism, but the historic view saw this woman sitting on the beast. They probably represent as the Pope, dressed in all this garb, and a lot of this imagery sounds like a pope, with the colors of his garments and all the decked out jewels and the cup and the turban and all this other type of stuff. I think they actually prefer this view because it takes the heat off them. But the Rome we're talking about is not the Rome that they love, you see. It's the pagan empire. But it did become the center of Christianity, but after this, okay?
That's all I was going to say, was that this was before Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome. So this is the pre-Christian emperor worship Rome.
Right. That's exactly right. And as a matter of fact, some people actually, because it may have been even a Roman Catholic either priest or doctor of the church or something who may have originally suggested this as a possibility, that has made people who are dyed-in-the-wool historical view, and these would be the people that today would follow the Puritans so closely. The Puritans believed in this historic view of the book of Revelation, that it's talking about in a linear fashion, not by backing up and going over the same ground again, but each of these things is a different event in history moving forward to the second coming of Christ. And they figured a lot of this language heavily on the papacy. So the Roman Catholic Church hates this view, and I think that they may have been among the first to actually suggest that it may be more along these lines, what the book means, which is quite interesting. I've only read allusions to that. I don't know that to be a fact.
There are plenty of parallels that can be drawn between the apostate Jews and the priesthood and the fallen priesthood and the papacy of Rome. I mean, it's an understandable equation there.
Well, it's true too when you think about how ornate Roman worship is, how they actually draw from the Old Testament, I think, to deck out the environment and say, well, God required that the temple be decked out, as it were, and the priests be, decked out as they are, and so forth. And so we should have that same kind of visual glory in our worship, and so we deck the whole place out kind of thing. But when they do that and they're emulating this kind of imagery we get from the Old Testament, then you can see if John is actually talking about the priesthood, the Jewish priesthood, how the similarities exist between the Jewish priesthood and the Roman Catholic priesthood as far as the way it looks. So, yeah, very tempting to do that. Okay, any questions, last questions or comments? All right, the next time we'll look a little bit more at this woman and how she is basically represented as almost an anti-priest, or as a priest that's become a harlot, as it were. And we'll also consider the angel's interpretation and how that all fits together. So, anyway, if there aren't any further questions, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for the time we've had to study the book of Revelation and for some of the review as we move into the section of the covenant divorce. We do pray that you would help us to understand this as fully as